The 1980s were an era when studios greenlit things that probably should not have been greenlit, and then occasionally those same wrong-headed gambles turned out to be right. Just not in the theater, not in the first week, and not for reasons anyone planned. Home video changed everything. Cable changed everything. Word of mouth across decades changed everything. These are the 15 flop movies from the 80s that turned into global hits. Number 15, Clue, 1985.
Indeed, no, sir. I'm merely a humble butler.
What exactly do you do?
I battle, sir.
Clue arrived in theaters in December 1985 with a genuinely inventive gimmick. 3 different endings were filmed and distributed to different theaters simultaneously, so audiences in one city saw a different resolution than audiences in another. The studio hoped this novelty would drive discussion and repeat viewings. Instead, audiences found the whole concept confusing. The critical reception was lukewarm, and the film earned approximately $14.6 million against a budget of around $15 million. A straightforward theatrical flop. What happened afterward is one of the more complete cult rehabilitation stories in American cinema. When Clue went to home video and then cable, the all 3 endings version became available, and the film's specific pleasures, the rapid-fire comedic pacing, Tim Curry's extraordinary performance as Wadsworth the butler, the ensemble chemistry between Eileen Brennan, Madeline Kahn, Christopher Lloyd, Michael McKean, Martin Mull, and Leslie Ann Warren, came through in a living room context in a way that a crowded theater screening apparently hadn't communicated. The film is now considered a defining camp comedy, and Tim Curry's work in it is routinely cited as one of the great comedic performances of the decade. Number 14, Tron, 1982.
I'd say welcome, friend. But not here, not like this.
I don't even know what I'm doing here.
Tron was the most technically ambitious film Disney had made in years when it was released in July 1982, deploying early computer-generated imagery on a scale that had never been attempted in a feature film. The production spent approximately $17 million. The theatrical gross was approximately $33 million domestically, which sounds profitable, but was not, because marketing and distribution costs were substantial, and Disney had expected significantly more given the scale of the production investment. The critical response was uneven. Some reviewers found the visuals extraordinary, others found the story thin. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences disqualified Tron from the Best Visual Effects category that year on the grounds that using computers to create effects was considered cheating, a decision that has not aged well in retrospect. The rehabilitation of Tron was built on exactly what the film was actually about. It spoke directly to a generation of young people who were spending significant time with early video games and personal computers, and it did so in a way that resonated far more on repeated home video viewings than in a single theatrical encounter. The imagery became iconic. The film became a foundational text for a whole generation's relationship with digital culture and the 2010 sequel Tron. Legacy is a direct testament to how completely the franchise recovered from that initial stumble. Number 13, The Thing, 1982.
We got to it before it had time to finish.
Finish what?
Finish imitating these dogs.
John Carpenter's The Thing opened in June 1982 in what turned out to be one of the most competitive summers in science fiction and horror film history. It opened the same weekend that E.T. the Extraterrestrial, Spielberg's warm, family-friendly alien story, was still dominating theaters from its June 11th opening. Poltergeist had opened a week before The Thing. Blade Runner opened the same day. The summer of 1982 was a moment when American audiences were clearly hungry for science fiction, and The Thing, cold, paranoid, unrelentingly grim, was simply the wrong kind of science fiction for what audiences wanted at that particular moment. It earned approximately $19.6 million against a production budget of approximately $15 million. Technically profitable, but considered a disappointment given Universal's expectations and the scale of the production. The reviews were harsh in ways that read as almost incomprehensible now. Roger Ebert gave it 2 stars and described it as a geek show a gross-out movie in which teenagers can dare each other not to look at the screen. Other critics found it nihilistic and emotionally hollow. The reassessment of The Thing was gradual and then overwhelming. The film began appearing on horror critics' best of decade lists in the late 1980s and continued climbing through subsequent decades. The practical special effects work by Rob Bottin, achieved at significant personal cost, with Bottin reportedly hospitalized for exhaustion during production, have proved genuinely timeless in a way that CGI-based creature effects rarely achieve. The paranoid ensemble dynamic, the Antarctic setting, the radical ambiguity of the film's ending, all of these elements that critics in 1982 found cold and alienating are exactly the elements that subsequent audiences found compelling. The 2011 prequel/remake demonstrated how completely the original had been rehabilitated by generating almost universal disappointment from audiences who had come to understand what made Carpenter's version exceptional. Number 12, Blade Runner, 1982.
But you're gonna spot him and you're gonna air him out.
I don't work here anymore. Give it to Holden. He's good.
Blade Runner had one of the most troubled theatrical runs of any film that subsequently became a canonical masterpiece. Released in June 1982, it earned approximately $27.6 million against a production budget of approximately $28 million, essentially breaking even but not performing at the level Harrison Ford's post-Star Wars box office reputation would have suggested. The reviews were divided, and the theatrical version that audiences saw in 1982 included a voiceover narration by Ford and an optimistic ending that the film's director, Ridley Scott, did not want. The transformation of Blade Runner from disappointment to masterwork is one of the more complex stories in cinema history, involving multiple subsequent versions of the film. The 1992 director's cut removed the voiceover and the happy ending, and the 2007 final cut made additional refinements, each of which revealed more of Scott's original vision. The film's influence on science fiction cinema, on visual design, and on the genre of neo-noir proved so pervasive that by the 1990s, it was impossible to imagine the decade's science fiction landscape without it. Blade Runner 2049, the 2017 sequel directed by Denis Villeneuve, is another testament to how completely the original's reputation had been rehabilitated. Number 11, The Shining, 1980.
Say, Lloyd, it seems I'm temporarily late. How's my credit in this joint, anyway?
The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick and released in May 1980, was a commercial and critical puzzle on arrival. It earned approximately $44 million domestically, which on paper looks respectable until you factor in the film's complicated positioning in the marketplace. It was marketed as a Stephen King adaptation at a time when King's name represented one of the strongest guarantees of audience interest in horror, and yet King himself publicly and persistently criticized Kubrick's version as a fundamental misunderstanding of the novel's emotional core. King's dissatisfaction was not whispered. It was expressed in interviews, in essays, and in his eventual production of a television miniseries version in 1997 that hewed more closely to his original text. The studio had expected King's brand to sell the film. King's brand was actively working against it. Meanwhile, the critical reception in 1980 was divided in ways that are difficult to explain in retrospect. Pauline Kael and other significant critics found the film cold, mechanical, and emotionally empty. The horror community was uncertain what to make of a film that seemed to operate according to rules of its own, rather than the genre conventions that audiences had established expectations for. The rehabilitation happened slowly and entirely through home video and repeated viewing. The Shining rewards the kind of close attention that a home viewing environment allows in ways that a single theatrical screening simply cannot unlock. The recurring visual motifs, the spatial impossibilities in the Overlook Hotel's floor plan, the accumulation of detail in the background of shots that reward pausing and rewinding. By the late 1990s, the film had been reevaluated completely. The documentary Room 237, 2012, which documented the elaborate theories that deeply obsessive viewers had developed about Kubrick's imagery and intentions, was only possible because those obsessive viewers existed in significant numbers. Jack Nicholson's performance is now simply furniture in the American cultural landscape. Number 10. Heathers, 1988.
What's the question?
Yeah, so what's the question, Heather?
God damn, Heather, you were with me in study hall when I thought of it.
I forgot.
Heathers arrived in March 1988 with a marketing challenge that New World Pictures had essentially no framework for solving. A pitch-black satirical comedy about high school social hierarchies, murder, and the cult of popularity, written by Daniel Waters and directed by Michael Lehman, starring two relative unknowns named Winona Ryder and Christian Slater. The film earned approximately $1.1 million in its limited theatrical release. Not a flop in the catastrophic sense of a studio losing tens of millions on a tentpole production, but a film that found essentially no audience at all in the theaters that played it. The VHS story of Heathers is one of the more complete examples of home video as the primary discovery mechanism for a significant film. The movie circulated through video stores in the late 1980s with the specific energy of an underground find. The kind of thing you watched at a friend's house, couldn't believe existed, and immediately recommended to every person you knew. Winona Ryder's Veronica and Christian Slater's J.D., a genuine teenage sociopath wearing James Dean affectations, were characters who felt unlike anything that mainstream cinema had offered the high school audience. By 1990, Winona Ryder was one of the most important young actresses in American film. By 1992, she was among the most prominent actresses in American film, period. Each step in her visibility sent new audiences back to Heathers. The film's specific comedic language, the deadpan delivery of genuinely dark material, the merciless accuracy of its high school social observation, proved to influence a generation of subsequent dark teen comedies more directly than almost any other single film. Mean Girls, 2004, Jennifer's Body, 2009, and the entire genre of teen social satire that followed owe a structural debt to Heathers that its makers have acknowledged in various contexts. The musical adaptation that opened off-Broadway in 2014 and was later revised is the most recent evidence that the film's cultural life continues to expand. Number 9. Big Trouble in Little China, 1986.
Can I ask you a serious question?
Absolutely not.
Well, then would you ever consider just jumping right into
Sure, but never with a person in your condition.
Big Trouble in Little China was John Carpenter's follow-up to Starman, released in July 1986 when he was still a commercially viable director. The studio, 20th Century Fox, released it the same weekend as James Cameron's Aliens, which is either a marketing decision or an act of scheduling that no reasonable studio executive would want to take credit for in hindsight. The film earned approximately $11.1 million domestically against a budget of approximately $25 million. A clear and documented box office failure. Kurt Russell's performance as Jack Burton, a blustering, wrong-about-everything truck driver who is technically the sidekick in his own adventure story, is the film's central comedic achievement. The inversion of the action hero template. The genuinely inventive blend of martial arts, fantasy, and American Western mythology, and Carpenter's irreverent tone all work together in a way that took several years for audiences to locate. The film is now a touchstone of 80s cult cinema, and Russell has spoken about it with evident affection in multiple interviews as among the most fun he has had on any production. Number 8. The Iron Giant, 1999, but based on 1968 novel, Animated Spirit of 80s.
It's okay!
My God.
He isn't gonna—
Run, kid, run!
The Iron Giant is a 1999 film that carries the emotional DNA of 1980s family adventure filmmaking so completely that it belongs here in spirit, if not in strict decade placement. Directed by Brad Bird and released in August 1999, it earned approximately $23.1 million domestically against a production budget of $70 million. a significant box office failure that Warner Brothers attributed partly to a marketing campaign that undersold the film's emotional depth in favor of action sequences. The film's subsequent arc is one of the more complete vindications in animation history, as home video and DVD release allowed audiences to discover what the theatrical campaign had not communicated: a deeply moving story about a boy, a giant robot, and the choice between violence and identity. The film gradually accumulated the reputation it now holds, as one of the finest animated films ever made, and as a film that distills the best instincts of the Amblin-era family adventure into an original story. The I Am Not a Gun central theme resonates in a way that most explicitly message-driven children's films never achieve. Number 7. Labyrinth, 1986.
Listen, she's going to say the word.
I can bear it no longer!
Labyrinth arrived in June 1986, carrying the combined weight of Jim Henson's vision, George Lucas's executive producing credit, and David Bowie in the role of Goblin King Jareth, an assemblage of talent that the studio, TriStar Pictures, expected to translate into a significant commercial event. The film cost approximately $25 million to produce and earned approximately $12.9 million in its domestic theatrical run. The reviews were mixed to negative. Critics generally acknowledged the visual imagination, but found the story thin, the pacing uneven, and the emotional stakes unclear. Jim Henson was reportedly devastated by the film's commercial failure. He had invested significant creative energy in Labyrinth and in its companion project, The Dark Crystal, 1982, which had also disappointed at the box office. He died in 1990, without seeing the long-term trajectory of either film. The rehabilitation of Labyrinth is completely inseparable from David Bowie's presence in it. Bowie's Jareth, imperious, glittering, genuinely dangerous, performing original songs including Magic Dance and As the World Falls Down, that he wrote for the film, provided an adult magnetism at the center of what was ostensibly a children's fantasy that drew viewers back to the film long after the theatrical run was over. The original songs were not incidental to this. They were integrated into the fabric of the film in ways that made Bowie's performance feel like a genuine artistic commitment rather than a celebrity appearance. Jennifer Connelly's Sarah, navigating the labyrinth to rescue her baby brother from Jareth's Goblin Kingdom, provides the film's emotional through line and is a stronger performance than the critical reception of 1986 acknowledged. Brian Froud's visual design and Jim Henson's creature workshop brought a menagerie of genuinely inspired characters to life. The combination created an aesthetic that has held its grip on every generation that has encountered the film, and Bowie's death in January 2016 produced a renewed wave of affection for Labyrinth that was global in its reach. Number 6. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, 1971. 70s film, but defining 80s home video experience.
The Candyman. The Candyman can.
Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory was released in 1971 and performed modestly at the box office. Not a disaster, but not the success Paramount had hoped for from a film produced in partnership with Quaker Oats, which had bankrolled the production as a marketing vehicle for its Wonka candy brand. Gene Wilder's performance as Wonka divided critics, and the film's marketing was complicated by the candy promotion origins. The entire second life of this film was built on television and home video exposure through the 1980s. Millions of children born in the 1970s encountered Willy Wonka on television, in the pre-cable era when a holiday broadcast of the film was an event. By the mid-1980s, VHS copies circulated through every home library. Gene Wilder's Wonka became the definitive performance, strange, mercurial, genuinely unsettling in specific scenes that most children's films carefully avoided. The film's place in the cultural memory of anyone who grew up in the 1980s is as secure as any film of the decade itself, despite having been made the decade before. Number 5. Escape from New York, 1981.
Greenhouses, rigged up generators. Some areas have streetlights.
Escape from New York arrived in July 1981 with a budget of approximately $6 million and a theatrical gross of approximately $25.2 million, which was commercially successful, not a flop in the strict sense. But the film's global cultural reach and its status as a foundational text of dystopian science fiction were built on something well beyond its initial theatrical performance. John Carpenter and Kurt Russell's first major collaboration established the Snake Plissken character as one of the defining anti-heroes of the era, and the film's grim vision of a Manhattan-turned-maximum security prison spoke to an urban anxiety that felt entirely credible in 1981. The film's influence extends through decades of subsequent dystopian cinema and gaming. The Metal Gear Solid video game franchise borrowed Plissken's aesthetic directly enough that Carpenter and Russell considered legal action. The combination of the low budget that forced creative solutions and Carpenter's assured directorial hand produced a film that punched well above its resources. The 1996 sequel Escape from L.A. is evidence of the franchise's durability, if not its consistent quality. Number 4, 16 Candles, 1984.
I think it's too healthy to get all jacked up about some guy that isn't even a thing yet. Yeah, when you don't have anything, you don't have anything to lose, right?
16 Candles was John Hughes's directorial debut, released in May 1984 on a budget of approximately $6.5 million. It earned approximately $23.7 million domestically, which by the narrow measure is a profitable film. The reason it appears here is that its global iconic status as the defining teenage romantic comedy of its decade, as the film that established Molly Ringwald as the era's representative teenager, as the template for virtually every subsequent American teen comedy, far exceeds what the box office numbers suggest about its initial reception. It was liked. It was not understood as the defining document it would become. The Hughes teen comedy canon, 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, 1985, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 1986, Pretty in Pink, 1986, was assembled across 3 years and recognized almost immediately in retrospect as something that had not existed before. A serious, emotionally honest engagement with adolescent experience from inside that experience. 16 Candles, the first of these, established the terms on which the rest were built, and Molly Ringwald's performance grounded all of it in a specifically female perspective that the genre had almost never attempted before. Number 3, The Outsiders, 1983.
If you had to go by yourself, you should have carried a blade.
Oh yeah, that would have been a great excuse for the socialist to cut his neck a little more there.
Francis Ford Coppola directed The Outsiders in 1983, adapting S.E. Hinton's 1967 young adult novel with a cast of young actors that included Tom Cruise, Matt Dillon, Patrick Swayze, Ralph Macchio, Rob Lowe, Emilio Estevez, and C. Thomas Howell, a concentration of eventually significant talent that was not fully apparent at the time of release. The film earned approximately $25.7 million against a budget of approximately $10 million. Profitable, but received critically as a somewhat mannered and overly stylized adaptation that did not fully realize the novel's appeal. The film's long-term cultural standing has been shaped by two factors: the subsequent careers of its young cast, which turned every viewing into a catalog of early performances by actors who would define American cinema through the 1980s and 1990s, and the novel's persistent presence in American school curricula, which guaranteed new generations of readers who sought out the film adaptation. Coppola released a longer director's cut in 2005 that reassessed the film more favorably. The original theatrical cut has aged in some respects and not in others, but the cultural position of The Outsiders as a document of a specific 1980s relationship between adolescent identity and American mythology is secure. Number 2, The Wizard of Oz, 1939, but the 80s generation's childhood film.
Oh, but he doesn't do it every day, just once or twice a week, and he can't catch our old cat anyway.
The Wizard of Oz was released in 1939 and was not, by the standards of its time, the commercial triumph MGM needed from a film that had cost nearly $3 million to produce. It recovered its costs over time, but its initial run was not the blockbuster the studio had expected. The film's transformation into one of the most universally known American cultural objects in history was built almost entirely on television, beginning with its CBS broadcast in 1956, and then annual Thanksgiving broadcast tradition that continued through the 1960s and 1970s. An entire generation of Americans who grew up in the 1980s had their relationship with the film established through the television experience, not a theatrical one. The first generation to grow up with the VHS copy, able to watch The Wizard of Oz not on annual schedule but whenever they wanted, was the 1980s generation. The film became available in home video in the early 1980s, and the familiarity it generated across that decade produced a relationship between the film and the American cultural memory that is difficult to overstate. For audiences over 50, the MGM lion roar at the beginning of The Wizard of Oz is not a studio logo. It is a memory of childhood. Number 1. The Shawshank Redemption, 1994. 90s film, archetypal flop to global hit story.
I've seen such a sorry-looking heap of maggot shit in all my life.
The Shawshank Redemption was released in September 1994 and earned approximately $16 million in its initial domestic theatrical run, a number that, for a film that had cost approximately $25 million to produce and market, represented a clear commercial failure. 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, were announced in February 1995. This was the beginning of the transformation. The Academy Award attention drove a theatrical re-release that brought the total domestic gross to approximately $58 million. But the real story of Shawshank is HBO. Starting in 1995, HBO began airing the film with remarkable frequency. By some estimates, it was the most aired film on HBO in the late 1990s and into the 2000s. Each broadcast introduced new audiences who had missed it in theaters, and each audience that found it reported the experience of the film's 2-hour and 22-minute runtime dissolving into something that felt much shorter. The word of mouth that the theatrical release had failed to generate in time to save its box office numbers kept building for years after the theatrical run was over. By the time the IMDb Top 250 became a reference point for cinematic consensus in the 2000s, The Shawshank Redemption had climbed to number 1, a position it has held with remarkable consistency for over 2 decades, displacing The Godfather. Whether it deserves that specific ranking is a conversation that people have been having since roughly 2008, but the fact of its position there is not in dispute. A film that could not find its theatrical audience became the most loved film in the world, according to the most widely consulted audience ranking in the history of cinema. 15 films that the original audiences missed, underestimated, or simply encountered at the wrong moment, and that found their true audience through every channel that came after: home video, cable, DVD, streaming, and the simple passage of time have a way of correcting the record. Hit that like button and subscribe. More content like this coming.